Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good, 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 good. Everybody's awake. That's really good. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm really excited for the recital you all are about to hear. Just a quick rundown of the schedule. Everything's listed in the program. First, we'll have two pieces by my wonderful friends being played. Next, I will give a presentation on my research to give more context to what you heard and what you will hear after my presentation. Then, after my presentation, there will be one more piece played. After the piece, we'll have a short informal dialogue. We'll have another microphone to pass around so you all can give me your thoughts in real time on the piece that you just heard. And after all that, we'll have a reception. So once again, thank you everybody for coming, and I hope you all enjoy the music. Hello, hello. All right. How did y'all like the first two pieces? That is really, really good. Really good, really good. I'm very glad. So just a little background on those two pieces. This is all in the program, of course, but the first piece is one that I had composed for the Emory Composer Society, which was one of the first clubs that I joined when I came here to Emory. And we had our Emory Chamber Connections concert in one of the theme housing houses here. And it was my first time playing, of course, when that piece was premiered, I was playing the viola part. So it was my first time playing my own music in more of a more public setting. And it was a really nice experience. The second piece you heard, Ijiyule, which is the Yoruba translation for strong storm or hurricane. And that piece was premiered in the second Chamber Connections concert that I did when I was a sophomore. So it was really nice kind of seeing my growth as a composer over the years, and that is the main reason why I put those two pieces on this program. Now, to provide more context for the piece that you're about to hear and more context for my honors thesis overall, I have this presentation. The title of the presentation, as you can see, is Musical Minds, Exploring the Connection Between Music and Emotions. So, here's a little timeline of what we'll be going over today. First, I will give an overview of my project. Next, I will talk about current theories in the fields of music-evoked emotions. Next, I'll talk about the neurobiology of music-evoked emotions. And lastly, I'll provide more context for Imolara, which is the last piece that you will hear in this concert. So, regarding the project overview, how did we get here? I'd like you to watch this video first. It's a pretty short video, very cute video. So I was watching, my parents had taped these videos of me when I was much younger on VHS tapes. So we as a family were watching these videos, and I had posted some of these on my Instagram story, and the Instagram app had like made a collage of all of these stories, and they put a piece in the background. The piece, it's relatively popular, but it's the opening to the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. And when I saw this video for the first time, I myself was hit with such a really strong wave of nostalgia and sadness, and I was wondering, well, it's definitely because of that piece. At that point, I'd never heard the piece before, but hearing that piece was really what evoked that emotion in me, because if it was a different piece that had been used, I definitely wouldn't have had the same emotional reaction. So with that in mind, I conceived of this honors thesis, which has two components. The first component is a recital of compositions that you are currently sitting at right now, and the second portion is actually a written thesis. I've been doing a lot of research into the fields and more like lit reviews of the current topics in the fields of music-evoked emotions from the realm of like neuroscience and more music cognition and psychology. And I will go provide more context and give a little overview of the findings that I have found in my own research. So, on to the current theories. So, regarding classification of music-evoked emotions, there are two prevailing models. There is the discrete model of emotion, which, if we think of like Disney's Inside Out, they categorize emotions into very discrete categories. It was coined by Paul Ekman in 1998, and the emotions that he had put were fear, anger, disgust, sadness, and happiness. However, most other studies, a lot of people and scientists will modify the emotions used as they see fit. The other model of categorizing music-evoked emotions is the dimensional emotional model, which was coined by James Russell in 1980, and rather than having distinct categories for emotional affects that pieces can have, he theorized that we could plot all of these emotions on a two-dimensional axis, with an x-axis of valence and a y-axis of emotional arousal. Now you might ask, CG, what do those terms mean? Funny you ask. So, emotional valence is more or less a measure of the positivity that a piece has. Very high valence, very high positivity, very happy of sorts. Low valence, more less positivity and more sad. Regarding arousal or excitement or energy, as the title suggests, it's more of a measure of the energy that a piece has. So in James Russell's circumplex model, he had originally plotted out 8 affects on this diagram. For example, he had excitement in the top right quadrant because excitement has a really high valence. It's a positive emotion and it has a lot of energy when we think of excitement. So that is why it has high values of valence and arousal. And when we think about something like depression, which has a very negative connotation, right? It has a very low valence and it also has a low arousal, a low amount of energy. Now, that is a lot of very technical jargon. What I have is a little interactive activity for us to try to put this into action. So if you would, everybody, if you can scan this QR code with your camera app and it will take you to a survey. In this survey, you're going to, there'll be two different models, both the dimensional and the discrete model, and you all will be able to log how you feel about a piece that is about to play next. Give it a couple minutes so that everybody can scan this. Alrighty, just to check, can everybody raise your hand if you have scanned it and you have the form available? Perfect, perfect. All right, so the piece you're about to hear is one I'm certain you all have heard before. Here it is. All right, now that you have heard that piece, you can log how you feel the emotional valence, emotional arousal regarding the dimensional scale and how you feel this piece rates on the dimensional emotional, discrete emotional categorization. And I'll pull up some of the responses here. Just refresh this page real quick. So, we're seeing things like happy, upbeat, fancy, exciting, energetic, buzzing, jubilant. I really like that word, jubilant. Bright, sharp, brisk, right? So these are all more personal and more open-ended ways of categorizing this. Then, as we can see, this is a piece that overall seems to have a very high amount of valence, so it's very positive, and a very high amount of emotional arousal. And regarding the discrete categories, we're seeing a very high amount of joy and not so much for the others. So, and these are the same exact findings that have been found when this piece has been used in research. This is a pretty popular piece that is used in a lot of scientific studies. So, after doing this activity, we have the million-dollar question. Are music-evoked emotions real? When we think about music-evoked emotions, are these actually causing people to feel these emotions, or is it just more of a placebo effect type of thing? Well, this exact question is something that is heavily debated in the field, and there are two prevailing theories. We have the cognitivist theory and the emotivist theory. The cognitivist theory states that when people are talking about music-evoked emotions, they are just identifying the piece. They're saying this piece sounds happy, but it doesn't necessarily make me feel happy. On the other hand, the emotivist theory supporters are like, no, when people are talking about music-evoked emotions, there are physiological changes that are happening in the body that can be concluded that are causing people to actually feel these emotions. So, with that in mind, in 1997, Carol Krumholzl wanted to study this exact thing. So what she had done is she had two test groups. Her first test group sorted an arrangement of Western classical music pieces into the discrete categories of sadness, fear, and happiness. And then in her second group, she then had the second group listen to these pieces while they were hooked up to machines that would read their physiological biomarkers. Things like IBI for inner beat interval, things like this for finger pulse transmission time. So she's reading biodata like skin conductance and heart rates and things like that. So what did she find? Well, she found that all of the excerpts across the board were able to cause a significant mean change in the physiological biomarkers. So when they were listening to music, they were having a physical change that was significantly more than what they had when they were not listening to music. Then to be more specific, sad excerpts had the largest changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance. Fear excerpts had the largest changes in blood transit time and amplitude. Happy excerpts had the largest change in respiration measures, like how deeply they were breathing as they were listening to these. So all in all, this study does support the emotivist theory. However, this study was done last century in 1997. More recently, Julia Merrill in 2020 kind of wanted to build upon the findings of Carol Krum-Hansel. So she did another experiment where she also looked at physiological biomarkers, in this case specifically heart rate, skin conductance, and respiration rate. But what she wanted to focus on is how people's locus of attention affects the magnitude of the changes that they feel. That's a lot of words. All in all, whether they are focusing on the music itself, which was the perceived task as they were listening to these excerpts, where she instructed them to pay attention to how the pieces represented the emotion. And then the other task was the felt task, where the other half of the group was instructed to think about how themselves felt as they were listening, as opposed to thinking more about the music. So what did she find? She found that there was a positive correlation between musical energy, a dimensional factor we talked about before, arousal, and the mean change in physiological biomarkers. So once again, when tension or energy or musical arousal was increasing, their heart rate was increasing, their skin conductance was increasing, and the respiration rate was increasing. But more specifically, what she found that there was a higher mean response in physiological biomarkers for the perceived task rather than the felt task, which was something very interesting to me. So this means that when people were paying attention to how they felt, their body was not responding as strongly as it was if they were paying attention more to the music itself, which is extremely interesting. So all of these studies that we've talked about so far were done in the US. What about other cultures? Because emotions are something that are really important with regards to cultural context. So it might not be the same case that if we're finding all these studies here in the US, it would be the same across the seas. So in 2009, Fritz et al. Went to study this exact thing. They went to Cameroon to study the Mofa tribe people, and they had 2 tests. Their first test was just to preliminarily make sure that the Mofa tribe people and the Western participants were able to classify emotions in general. So they gave them these photos of this woman, and they asked them to sort these photos into these 3 discrete categories of happiness, sadness, and fear. And as we can see, both the Mofa listeners and the Western listeners were above this chance level in their recognition rate. So yes, both the Mofa tribe people and the US listeners were able to identify emotions facially. But a thing to note is that across the board, Mofa listeners had a less accurate recognition rate, which once again goes to show that emotions are a very culturally context thing. The same sorts of faces that we make over here might not be the exact same sort of faces that are made overseas. So once they had done this preliminary test, they went into more of the musical realm. So they took some really, some Western pieces and Mofa pieces that had really high valence, really high joy. And then what they did, those were the original pieces. Then what they did is they spectrally manipulated both of these pieces. So they took the original recording of the piece, then overlaid it with another recording of the same piece at a very dissonant interval of a tritone. So a tritone is an augmented fourth. It splits the octave evenly in half, and this is what it sounds like. So the entire piece sounded like that. So we had the original pieces that were very happy, and then the spectrally manipulated pieces, which sounded like that for the entire duration. And what did they find? Well, number one, as I said earlier, Mofa tribe people were able to identify basic emotions facially, which is what they found in A and B. Mofa tribe people were able to recognize and assign emotional valence to the pieces. So across the board, the Mofa listeners and the Western listeners both assigned higher valence to the original Mofa music and the original Western music. And they, Fritz et al., concluded that both groups would prefer the original Western and Mofa music over their spectrally manipulated versions. Now this is all nice and dandy, but this is only one other culture, and this study was also done in 2009. Is there anything more recently that's happened? There has been, in fact. So in 2015, Argstatter wanted to kind of build upon those preliminary results and took to studying these discrete emotional identification with German participants, Norwegian participants, Korean participants, and Indonesian participants. In this case, the musical excerpts used were actually improvised by musicians, with the musicians themselves had intentionally improvised these pieces to fall within the discrete categories of happiness, sadness, surprise, fear, disgust, and anger. Once again, as I said previously, many studies will add and subtract certain types of discrete emotions as they see fit. So in this case, when the participants were listening to the pieces that the musicians had improvised, they had a little checklist that had each of these 6 discrete emotions on them. in their native language, of course, and this was cross-checked by an expert linguist in each of their respective cultures. So what did Argstatter find? He found that cross-culturally, the ability to detect musical emotions was restricted to happiness and sadness. So the only two discrete categories that had all cultures above the 50% line is happiness and sadness. And what he also found is what he coined as in-group advantage. So Western cultures seem to have a much higher accuracy with labeling and describing these musical excerpts and sorting them into these discrete categories than the Eastern cultures did have. And that was really interesting. And one of the main reasons that he discussed was due, once again, to cultural context. So he discussed that specifically in the Indonesian culture, the word that they had used for surprise on the survey had more of a negative connotation in the Indonesian language. But a lot of the musicians, the pieces that they had improvised, a lot of them were in the major mode, so they sounded happy, but they were meant to evoke maybe a sort of happy surprise rather than a sad one. So there was a significant decrease in the accuracy in the Indonesian group of this circle right here in the surprise task. And that was truly specifically due to some cultural differences and some translational differences. That is super interesting. Now, let's move on from more of the music cognition and psychology side to more of the hard neurology side. So, when we talk about the field of music-evoked emotions, one of the primary brain regions that is mentioned is the amygdala. It is a pair of almond-shaped nuclei in the temporal lobe of the brain, and one of its primary pathways that it's involved in is the limbic system, which is more commonly just the system that deals with emotions and giving physiological responses to emotions. So it involves other brain regions, such as the hippocampus with dealing with memory, and specifically the thalamus and hypothalamus. The hypothalamus deals with neurotransmitters. So the hypothalamus releases a neurotransmitter called corticotropin releasing hormone, which then downstream goes to your kidneys and releases hormones like cortisol, right? So when we're having a really, the amygdala is really important in the fight or flight response because of its connection to the hypothalamus right there. So a really important pathway the amygdala is involved in with regards to all sorts of sensory information, whether it's sight, whether it's touch, whether it's hearing, is these two specific informational pathways called the high road and low road pathways. I was trying to think of an example of how to demonstrate this, but while I was making this presentation, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this like black speck on my left arm. And before I could even react, I just slapped my left arm as hard as possible because I had no idea what it was. But that goes to show an example of the low road pathway. Before the emotional stimulus, that object that I saw, even reached my sensory cortex, before I was able to recognize what I saw, the information had already gone to my amygdala and I had an emotional response, right? So it really just goes to show the difference between these two pathways, the low road, which is a lot quicker, which deals with more reflexes and things like that, and the high road pathway is when you see something, you recognize it as scary, and then you have an emotional reaction. So, in the context of pieces, Leahy, Rohrmeyer, and Coelsch in 2013 wanted to see how the amygdala reacts and responds specifically to musical tension. Now, a very important caveat here is the fact that musical tension is something that is particular to people who have grown up with Western classical music. In the US, we've been surrounded with music like this our entire lives, so our brains sort of build up a certain expectations that we expect to happen, right? So for instance, this 5/7 chord resolving to a 1 chord is what we would call a perfect authentic cadence, and it's something that's found in a lot of music, right? So I'll play it really quickly here. So the red highlighted area, that tritone there, that augmented fourth, causes a sort of dissonance and sets up an expectation that that dissonance would then be resolved in the cadence there. And I left the pointer over there. Let me get that real quick. So with that in mind, what they did is they had participants listen to 4 different piano pieces and manually label how much tension they were perceiving to be felt. So as they were listening, The participants were saying, oh, I'm feeling this much tension, then I'm feeling this much tension here, then I'm feeling this much tension here. And as they were doing this, they were also hooked up to an fMRI, which stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. And what they found is that overall, during periods of increasing tension with regards to decreasing tension, there was a lot of energy here in Heschel's gyrus, which is the auditory cortex, which of course makes sense. If they're listening to something, we're going to have a lot of activity in the auditory cortex. However, when they zoomed in and did a region of interest analysis, what they found specifically is that there was a lot of activity in the amygdaloid region right here. So they concluded that in periods of increasing tension when compared to decreasing tension, we're also having increased amygdala activity. So moving on from the amygdala and certain brain regions into more of how these regions interact, neurons communicate with each other in the brain using neurotransmitters. A very famous neurotransmitter is dopamine. Raise your hand if you've heard of dopamine before at all. Yeah, the entire audience does, right? So dopamine is commonly known as the reward hormone. It's used in a lot of reward pathways, but also with movement and a lot of other things like that. Here we have shown as the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So this essentially is the pathway that becomes activated when we do things like eat food, or we do things like hit a jackpot when we're gambling, things like that. Right? So, and also a really important thing is to notice is that the amygdala is also included in this pathway, right? So, there's a precedent set by Blood and Zatorre in 2001. This is one of like the landmark studies in music-evoked emotions. And in that study, Blood and Zatorre had proved that when people are listening to music and they feel chills, they're actually having dopamine release here, which is really interesting because this pathway is something that's activated with regards to things like food, which we need to survive. It's also activated in things like reproduction. We're engaging in reproductive activities, which is also need for the survival of human species. Those are really tangible things. But they found that something like music, which isn't tangible, which isn't necessary, is also activating these exact same pathways. So with that in mind, Sunnypour et al. In 2011 wanted to kind of expand on that. And they wanted to see if there are different neurological pathways activating when we are waiting or anticipating a climactic moment, or whether we're actually experiencing a climactic moment. So in their study, they instructed participants to bring pieces that the participants themselves felt chills in. So they didn't select the pieces for the participants brought their own pieces in. And what they had found is that while the participants were waiting for the moments that usually gave them chills, these anticipatory times here, we're actually seeing an increase of dopamine in the right caudate nucleus, which is in the dorsal striatum. The dorsal striatum has two parts, the putamen and the caudate nucleus. So we're seeing an increased amount of dopamine in the right caudate in the anticipatory stage, but when we're actually experiencing the chills, we're actually seeing a lot of dopamine release here in the nucleus accumbens. So they had proved that, very interestingly, it's not just the same pathway being activated when we're dealing with chills and really climactic moments in pieces. They're actually two very distinct pathways, which is really, really interesting. Now, with all of the scientific mumbo jumbo out of the way, I will go and give more context for the piece you're about to hear, Imolara. So Imolara is the Yoruba word for feeling or emotion, and all of the pieces, all of the research papers that I had cited in this study, as well as others that are cited in my written thesis, they all use music, right? So I compiled a database of every single piece that was used in all of the studies that I had read, and I categorized them into the discrete categories that each study had shown they were proven to evoke. So all the joy pieces across the board, put them in the joy category, fear pieces in the fear category, anger pieces in the anger category. Very small side note, there was not a lot about music that evokes anger, which is really interesting, and the sadness pieces in the sadness category. So then from there, I listened to all these pieces and analyzed them through the lens of a composer, trying to break them down into the fundamental building blocks of composition, and specifically I landed on harmony, timbre, and tone, harmony, timbre, and texture. Harmony, the chord progressions being used, timbre as in the articulations and the quality of the sounds that are being used, and texture for the orchestration, who is playing where and why. So, with that in mind, I had composed this 20-minute 4-movement string quartet with 4 different movements, each intended to evoke a particular emotion. Now with that in mind, preliminarily, here's my bibliography. But here's the last slide here. As you are listening to this piece, I would really like for you to share how you are feeling in the moment. With this data from this is not going to be like published in my honors thesis. I just wanted to be able to give the audience a chance to just let me know how they're feeling. And then after the piece, we'll also have a sort of informal dialogue. We'll have another microphone to pass around the audience. And if there are any comments that you didn't make in the form, you can ask me and I'll answer it in real time. So with that in mind, raise your hand if you have not scanned the survey yet. All right, we'll give it a couple more minutes, then we'll be all done with this presentation. All right, so everybody scan this. So anyways, thank you everybody for listening to this presentation. I really hope that you were able to learn something. And I really hope you enjoy listening to Imolara. Hello. All right, all right. Can we get another round of applause for that fantastic performance? That was really something. We'll wait for one of my friends to come back out. We have another mic, and we will have a short discussion. I mean, you can ask me anything, or if there are any thoughts that you did not put in the form that you would like to say or ask me about now, would be a perfect time. You can just, if everyone who wants to speak, just raise their hand, and my friend Carol will give them the microphone.
Great job, CG. This is so impressive because people do honors thesis, but they just write them, and you're writing it an extra time through music and through the composer. So I really applaud your work. I'm curious if you can tell us if you have any like musical influences or composers that inspired you, not just from the neurobiological research that you did, but from the musical side.
I would say most definitely to that. In the very first movement titled Ayo, which is like joy in Yoruba, I had a lot of influence from Studio Ghibli music and Joe Hisaishi. When I was composing that piece, I was playing a lot of gigs with Carol and my other friends, and we were playing a lot of Studio Ghibli music in the gigs, and I'm like, you know what? I'm inspired. And then I'll say particularly the middle movement, the middle part of the second movement, which was in 9/8 time, was really inspired by Blue Ronda a la Turk, which is a famous piece that is in 9/8 time. And the last movement, I really had a lot of inspiration from Rachmaninoff, because as I said before, it was his piece that had inspired me to start this whole thing to begin with. So I wanted to kind of give my homage to him by utilizing some of the similar chord structures that he uses in some of his symphonies as well.
Brilliant performance, thank you very much. I'm just curious as to the sequence or the order of the last piece. So you started with Ayo or joy and then ended with sadness or Ibanuje. A lot of people will go away, with the last feeling from a show, a performance, and I'm just curious as to why that specific order.
That is an excellent question. So I kind of wanted, well, there's two reasons. So the first reason is structurally, I wanted my last movement to kind of be the most, I kind of want to say like mature out of all the movements. And both with the subject matter, the emotion that I wanted to represent, and then also the compositional techniques that I used and the style of writing that I used. And then the secondary reason is that while I was writing this piece, my uncle, who I had spent a lot of time with, who I loved very much, had passed away. So this piece was also, this movement was also an homage to him. And as I was concluding writing the piece, he had also concluded his life. So I wanted to kind of also just do that as an homage to him at the end of my piece.
Hello, CG.
Hello, Davisi.
First of all, a fantastic job, and thank you for trusting me to be a part of your work. During your presentation, you talked about one of the things you focused on for Imolar was who plays what, when, like where and why. And so I'm curious if you would mind expanding more upon the choices you made, as in who plays what, where, when, and why.
Yes, that is a very, 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 very good question. So if you notice, part of my compositional style is I tend to like to have everybody playing all the time, the entire time. And so that was part of it. But then also Dr. Young, my composition professor, had also kind of really, really, really suggested that I kind of go away from that and not have the entire 20 minutes of the piece. Everybody just kind of sawing away at their instrument. So there were times, like in the height of Ibinu for Anger's Movement 2, everybody was playing. It really was a lot of passion. I wanted a lot of passion. At the climax of Ijaya for Fear, at near the end, where it kind of sounded like a demented carnival ride at the end, I wanted everybody to be playing there as well. But the transition from there to Ibanuje, or Sadness Movement 4, Carol was the only one holding that note as a sort of like bridge from the past three movements, which were really easy for me to compose, and this new movement, which I wanted to have a much thinner texture. For a lot of parts, it's either one person, two people, or three people playing. And I wanted also to have a much softer dynamic. Like even at the end, the cello completely dropped out, and it was just this repeating figure happening in the top three voices that slowly kind of faded away. That I really wanted to have, if you recall the rhythm that Carol was playing, like the bum bum, bum bum, bum bum, I wanted that to represent a heartbeat. And then as the piece was ending, the heartbeat was slowly, 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 slowly fading away until nothing. So there's a lot of textural things that happened throughout the movement, but I think that those were the most important ones to me as the composer. All right, any other questions?
I can just ask, or should I wait for the mic? Carol, sorry you made it all the way down here for this question. CJ, congrats. That was amazing. I'm super proud of you. My question is, when does your music drop on iTunes?
That is a very good question. I've not really thought about it yet, but now that you brought it up, that's something that I'll
should.
definitely consider. If there are no more questions, we have a reception outside through those doors. We have one. But after the last couple questions, we'll have a reception, and you can all leave out that way. And I should have if you notice in the program notes for Imolara are not in there. There'll be an insert that I'll be able to get for you guys that will be out there so you can read about some of the compositional techniques that I put in the piece that I didn't want you to read before you listen to it, because I wanted your like upfront opinions on like how you felt about the piece. And I would like to thank everybody once again for coming. I'm really glad that I had such a good crowd today. Yes, we had a question.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
So, out of this is a bit more personal, but I was kind of wondering. I know you like video games a lot, and so I was wondering if you found any inspiration in any of those soundtracks.
Oh, absolutely. I would say after the opening theme in IO Movement 1, we had the bottom two voices like blitz off in like a da, 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 da. And I was listening to the opening theme from Octopath Traveler, and that was like immediately, I'm like, this is the sort of joy of adventure that I really wanted to portray in the beginning part of that piece. So that's the most blaring video game homage that I remember giving in the piece. Okay, I think it is food time. Yes.